Hello and welcome to Barn Blog, and occasionally I respond to comments. This comment was left on my Patreon about one of the two videos on DSA strategy, game theory, and path dependency. But we have a lot to do today. So let's get into it. I've removed the commenter's name so that he does not get any backlash. The commenter said, "Hey Varn, great episode on the DSA and game theory today. I thought very similar things about the uncommitted movement regards to Gaza during the 2024 election. Was wondering what your thought on the concept of control opposition and how it applies to the DSA, the Democratic Party, and groups like 5051 and Indivisible, and if so, what light it sheds on the nexus of political actors and how they behave." Now, this is a complicated question, and honestly, it may, even though it's short, end up being a couple episodes in response. Because to really treat this fairly, I have to develop some things out. Now, the commenter talks about control opposition, and we need to talk about its history. The concept of control opposition refers to a strategic maneuver where any number of powerful entities, or an entity or a state, typically a state, an intelligence agency, or a dominant political party, creates, funds, and subtly influences its own enemies. The goal is to provide a safe outlet for dissent, ensuring that any challenges to the status quo will remain within manageable boundaries. And this doesn't always look like just having milquetoast moderates be the dissent. It also can look like having radical flamethrowers being the dissent, because it has an effect on the public's perception. So historically, this tactic has a couple of different ramifications, and this tactic evolved from basic espionage to very sophisticated psychological and game theoretical operations. One of the most cited historical examples of control opposition comes from the Russian Empire. The Okhrana, the secret police, pioneered police socialism. Zubatovism was one of these. Named after Sergei Zubatov, this involved the state setting up illegal state-sanctioned labor unions. The idea was to channel workers' grievances away from revolutionary politics and towards bread-and-butter economic issues that didn't threaten the czar. Maybe cost capital a little more. Now, Zubatovism was a way to pacify a threat, but it was engineered directly. Father Gapon in 1905, Grigory Gapon was an Orthodox priest and an Okhrana asset. He led a massive workers' march. While Gapon's intentions were complex, the event, which became Bloody Sunday, demonstrated the danger when the state attempted to manage a movement that eventually spirals out of control. The reason why we talk about this is the Bloody Sunday massacre happened in response to it. Another example of control opposition is generally considered Operation Trust. So this was a Soviet counterintelligence operation that was set up by the OGPU, which was to fish out anti-Bolshevik underground organizing, particularly white, so the monarchist anti-Bolshevik organizing. So they set up something called the Monarchist Union of Central Russia. By convincing Russian intelligence agencies and exiled rights that a powerful internal resistance existed, they successfully were able to identify post-Civil War dissidents, lured the foreign agents into the USSR to be arrested, and neutralize many oppositions by making them wait for a planned uprising that was never going to happen. Let's not just stay over there in Eurasia, though. We need to talk about the United States, Because in the United States, instead of the simple espionage and setting up false faction, you had things like COINTELPRO, or the Counterintelligence Program, which ran from 1956 to 1971 and has been largely declassified. And it was utilized to control opposition, to neutralize domestic political movements. And rather than just arresting members, agents would infiltrate groups like the Black Panthers and various anti-war organizations and cause them to give away more information than they needed to, or to do something illegal. These were often agent provocateurs that would cite extreme radical positions to discredit the group in the eyes of the public, or incite internal violence between different members, or at least internal splitting, as was well documented with the RCP and the SDS when those COINTELPRO documents were also declassified. I would read Heavy Radicals for the RCP and the SDS version of that. So this steered organizations towards self-destruction and splintering. This was also well documentedly done in the CPUSA and a bunch of other groupings. So those are active control opposition, but there's some ways you can kind of think about this. These concepts were somewhat expanded in leftist literature by Debord Marcuse, although if you were to listen to Gabriel Rockhill, and he is not without some evidence, Marcuse may be a kind of control opposition himself. But Marcuse suggested that in advanced industrial society, tolerance for the fringe of dissents actually served as establishment by keeping that fringe in normal orbit. By allowing people to speak out without ever allowing the speech to lead to action, the system proves it's democratic and people can speak truth to power while remaining functionally unmovable and not responsive to public opinion, despite the fact that it's very well addressed. Now, I think we see this all the time. Another kind of control opposition of the spectacle, and comments on the society as spectacle, Debord argued that the media-driven spectacle can integrate its own critique. Opposition becomes a commodity or even a performance that reasserts the system's perceived flexibility without changing the underlying structure. So these are more diffuse forms of control opposition. We can kind of think of them as recuperation. So if you think about different tactics, we can see fronting. So we see that with Zubatovism and the monarchist association with Operation Trust. Both of them created various organizations for control, although they were very different. Zubatovism was based on creating state-sanctioned unions which could mimic real dissent, but also curtail it and break it away from radicalization, whereas Operation Trust would get names by setting up organizations and attracting people to those organizations. Then you have provocation and provocateurs, as well as splitting, which is infiltrating and radicalizing groups to ensure their public failure, either by bringing up ideological fault lines in the group and pushing on them, or by encouraging the group to do things illegal that can then be forwarded to the police. Lastly, there's recuperation, which is where you use the dissent to basically legitimize your rule because the dissent exists, but is in a controlled manner that really only manifests as speech and not action or even voting or anything. So, the term control opposition can refer to any of these things, but historically it referred to the first three. It's been expanded to refer to recuperation. We might talk about recuperation and elite capture separately, but let's go back to it, to the control opposition as a whole. I like doing etymological work. The term control opposition does not have a single neat inventor in a way that we can easily trace. It emerged as a descriptor for historical practices and gained traction through the 20th century political theory and later on through conspiratorial political analysis in the late 20th century. But we can trace who articulated the logic and then who articulated the terminology. The concept is often attributed to Lenin. He didn't use the exact English phrase, but Lenin is credited with the sentiment behind the concept. The question I have about this, though, is what he was really talking about was the Okhrana. And he may have used Okhrana tactics himself, but he didn't invent it. Furthermore, the researchers that attribute the best way to control the opposition is to lead it yourselves to Lenin don't have anything earlier than, I think, the early aughts, if not the late 90s, that attributes it to him. I've never seen it in his collective writings, and I don't know who supposedly overheard this conversation. Generally speaking, this quote is considered apocryphal, just like the sometimes years happen in a day quote, which also has some grounding in some things Lenin actually said, but the actual quote seems to be a paraphrase made by George Galloway in the 1990s that gets requoted over and over again. Such is the joys of the internet. But the Bolsheviks did establish Operation Trust, which seems to be based off Okhrana tactics. Guy Debord and the Situation International were the first people to really popularize the term recuperation. The process by which radical ideas or oppositional movements are neutralized and absorbed into the spectacle and thus into greater society. And this idea was first codified as a standard function of modern power rather than an espionage or secret police tactic. This actual recuperation shifted us to more modern usage. The exact phrase control opposition became a staple of political discourse through the post-World War II intelligence analysis. Details of Operation Trust and Zubatovism were translated and studied by Russian historians and intelligence officers. Control opposition became a shorthand for these strategies and the CIA. Now that's interesting, but it's also interesting that they were not just trying to fight this, but also trying to mimic it. Noam Chomsky also focuses on some of this, but he always focused on manufacturing consent. What Chomsky describes a similar mechanism where the media sets a narrow spectrum of allowable debate. This occurs within a fairly lively discussion that the spectrum, given the illusion of freedom, while strictly forbidding most ideas outside of it by fiat. Now, this is not the same as control opposition, though, and isn't even really the same as recuperation, but you can see how recuperation can be part of this by expanding the debate to cover certain kinds of dissent, making it look like those dissents have a voice, but also shutting them out of any real power. Now, when you ask if these groups like 5051 are indivisible, or the DSA, or the Democratic Party, or control opposition, there is absolutely no evidence that the first two definitions apply, that they're not creations of intelligence agencies, and it doesn't seem like there's any one group conspiring with them. But we can talk about the Democrats as an example because you list many different kinds of groups. So is the Democratic Party control opposition? Well, there's been a lot of opposition absorbed into it, but calling it a controlled opposition is a little bit of a metaphorical stretch. The Democratic Party is the oldest active political party in the world. While it is a party that is not necessarily oldest mass voter or mass engagement political party or mass membership political party, that would be the SPD in Germany, nor is it the oldest faction. that would be something in the British parliamentary system, or the Ghibellines, or the Greens and Byzantine, or something like that. But it is the oldest standing mass voter-based party in the world, actually. Even though it doesn't have a strong membership base like, say, the SPD did historically. The Democrats trace their lineage to the Democrat-Republican Party, are the Jeffersonian Republicans, and they were founded in 1792 by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. The Democrats were the party of the planters. They opposed Hamilton's and Washington's and John Adams's Federalist Party. They opposed the centralization of the bank. They advocated for decentralized government, states' rights, and agrarian society of small farmers that resisted the industrialization coming out of Britain. After the Federalists collapsed completely in 1812, due to the War of 1812. So the Democrat Republicans became the only major party, eventually being opposed by the Whigs, which led to a relatively fragile political unity. The Democratic Party split in 1824, and the unity did not last. The Democrat Republicans ran for president. Andrew Jackson was the most popular and got the electoral votes, but he didn't reach a majority. The House of Representatives ultimately chose John Quincy Adams. Jackson and supporters were furious, calling it a corrupt bargain. This event shattered the Democrat-Republican Party into two factions, which was the National Republican faction led by Adams and Henry Clay. This group was to become the Whigs, and the Jacksonians, who were led by Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren. The official birth of the Democratic Party as we know it is 1828. Martin Van Buren had a strategy, which was to mastermind the party structure. But Jackson was seen as a disciplinary head. He united the Southern planters with the Northern Plain Republicans, who were laborers and farmers, but not industrial laborers. And they formed a new kind of party because they're the first party to use modern campaign tactics, have national conventions, local party committees, and try to appeal to massive rallies. Meaning they appealed to the voter, not just the parliamentarians or Congress people. The Whigs and the Tories, which were, parties in and of themselves, and the British framework were really only things at the time that parliamentarians entered. They became more like American parties over time, but and also from the influence of the continent and membership parties like the SPD. So the modern party was really born with Andrew Jackson, and the Jackson faction dropped the Republicans, partly out of spite with the foundation of the National Republicans and the Whig Party, and simply became the Democrats. Now, later on, the Republican Party as we know it would be born when the Whigs flamed out a generation and a half later, and in the prelude to the Civil War, causing the Republicans to emerge, the National Republicans being the basis for the Whigs, and you see a massive shift in ideology. Now, the current alignment of the Democratic Party is a bunch of different interest groups, but it would be kind of foolish to say that the Democratic Party is control opposition in the earlier senses of the term, and the term that it was set up for espionage, because it's too old, frankly. It's the longest standing non-constitutional governmental organization in the United States, and one of the first modern political parties at all. It's considered the first mass-based political party, although unlike, say, the SPD, which had much more membership participation and required membership, whereas you could just affiliate with the Democratic Party through the rallies and local committees and whatnot. So an argument on whether a major political party like the Democratic Party constitutes a formally controlled opposition typically hinges on which version of the word we're using. If we use the strict intelligence community definition, a fake organization literally staffed and funded in secret by an opposing regime, the claim is pretty nonsensical for several structural and material reasons, including just the age of the party. If we use a more modern sense of control opposition, where the party functions to limit the scope of dissent, even if it's not actively set out to do so, and is not done through espionage, but through interpolation, donor influence, etc., then there is some argument that there are elements of the Democratic Party that are a controlled opposition, because, frankly, elements of the bourgeoisie fund both parties. But that's a very different meaning than the traditional meaning control opposition had in terms of national intelligence. And leftists should probably quit playing around with these broad meaning metaphors because they really confuse people. True control oppositions like the Okhrana or even the Operation Trust require a centralized monolithic authority to manage the deception. The Democratic Party is not a single entity, but a massive, loosely affiliated coalition of state parties that also have downstream affiliated donor groups, labor unions, NGOs, and voter affiliations and primaries. It's very hard to herd cats like this, controlling millions of diverse actors from suburban centrists to democratic socialists and even some old conservative Southern yellow dogs and the Black Congressional Caucus. To act in a scripted fake opposition would require a level of bureaucratic competence and secrecy that is historically unprecedented in a transparent and litigious society. For a party to be controlled by its opposition, there would need to be a general conflict over resources and power. And in reality, the two parties emerge in high-stakes competition for judicial appointments and budgetary allotment. The lifetime appointment of federal judges and Supreme Court judges creates real-world legal shifts that directly contravene the interests of the opposing party's base. And budgetary allotments are a zero-sum game, which are battles over real tax dollars, which enable things to be done. However, if the mechanism is recuperation and not outright control, the Democratic Party might be a little bit more complicated. Political theorists and, theorists in general will argue about how much control is actually necessary. Is it institutional inertia, oligarchical capture, recuperation that makes it seem like a control opposition, because it might effectively do the same thing, but how it got there and who's doing it are fundamentally different. The recuperation is a process in where radical energy is absorbed into the mainstream institution and moderated so it can be processed by the legislative system. And if that's your definition, recuperation happens and is possible in every single group that you talked about, most especially the Democratic Party. But even elements of the DSA, no matter what they mean and no matter how they're attending, would not be able to completely avoid it. Hell, even things that are not technically influence groups and are some kind of private political party like the CPUSA or the SPUSA or the PSL or the RCP or the RCI or any number of acronyms that represent various leftist parties with memberships between 200 and 7,000. Since they often do activism alongside progressives, and since their progressive activism is often tied to things more directly tied to the Democratic Party, even they wouldn't be removed from the recuperation charge. And definitely NGOs and things would also be implicated in it. Also, a control entity is designed to lose or to provide a safe outlet out. Political parties are vote-seeking machines in the United States. If the Democratic Party was purely control opposition, it would not fight all-out electoral wins in swing states. It just wouldn't try. Now, the loss of power results in loss of patronage, jobs for staffers, influence for lobbyists, and the internal drive for self-preservation makes such planned failure kind of counterintuitive. So for thousands of professionals whose careers depend on winning, as well as electeds who must maintain their constituency somehow. So while we can say that the party might be ineffective or insufficiently radical or even pretty heavily recuperated, which I think there's a good argument for, calling it control opposition in any way that suggests a top-down conspiratorial management ignores the chaotic, competitive, and profit-driven reality of American retail politics and also the people engaged in it. There's jobs on the line. But if we allow that recuperation happens primarily through engagement with electoral politics, even if we should still go into electoral politics, and I've never said we shouldn't, you have to deal with the realities that recuperation happens across the board. So yes, in so much that there are elements of the Democratic Party that are deeply recuperated and part of the same donor crosses as the Republican Party, it might be what we might call a semi-control opposition. So, while a strict intelligence agency definition of control opposition, a fake group run by a governmental or intelligence asset puppet master, doesn't align with the chaotic reality of American politics, many theorists and critics may argue that the Democratic Party functions as a structural form of a control opposition, which no one has to plan or actually even explicitly engage in. It's, to use an Althusserian term, interpolated upon you by engagement at all. In this view, the party's role is not a secret conspiracy, but a mechanical function of a two-party system that captures and neutralizes radical dissent, both left, right, and even in the center. So, is the Democratic Party a control opposition in this sense? Well, it can serve as a safety valve, and it definitely has sheepdogging elements. The most common argument that the party has is a capture mechanism for social movements that goes all the way back to the People's Party or the Populists liquidating into the Democrats in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. William Jennings Bryan being the prime example. This set up a path dependency where a lot of other groups, including the CPUSA and other socialist groups, have naturally either tried to ally with or liquidate into the Democratic Party as a whole. When it does, the party often adopts the rhetoric and even the policy stances of these groups while changing what the rhetoric refers to and hollowing out the policy stances to mean something far different, like, say, partial single payer or government organized markets without subsidies or price controls, as a kind of quasi-socialist medicine. Once these movements are brought into the fold of electoral politics, particularly if they get new people elected and new blood into the system, radical demands are often moderated into incremental policy tweaks. So you don't even get reforms, you get policy wonkery that often isn't even overseen by the Democrats themselves. This prevents movements from developing an independent third party or extra parliamentary power base that might actually threaten elements of the status quo that pay for Democrat electeds to continue to pursue office. So, yeah, they can serve as a safety valve or a sheepdog. And many people have argued that the Bernie campaign was ultimately a massive sheepdog for what came after the Occupy movement, which was a movement on the left that was really aimed at a Democratic president, but whose ability to handle its target and its target's relationship to Wall Street meant that a lot of it was captured from the get-go. And some of them, I do think, may have been set up by Democrats in the first place. So, I don't know that Occupy Democrats was always just a Democratic apologia mouthpiece, but it sure as hell became one even in the first few years of the second Obama administration. There's the left communist critique here that would argue that the Democrat being the left wing of capital or the liberal wing of capital would hold critics from left Marxist or even certain kinds of value form traditions would argue that both major parties are essentially factions of the same ruling class because they have donors from that ruling class that really oversee their funds way more than individual donors. And in this framework, the GOP and the Democratic Party simply offer two different ways of managing the capitalist state, both making both of them the bourgeois parties and also making anyone involved with them the left wing of capital. The GOP might favor deregulation and austerity, while the Democrats might favor social programs and civil rights to maintain stability, social peace, and a healthy workforce. But ultimately, their concerns are to maintain the workforce as a whole and to keep workers relatively in line. Because the party is funded and integrated into the same financial and corporate structures as its opposition, particularly in who gives up money. Almost every major corporation gives both parties money. Many labor unions give both parties money. It is structurally prevented, many labor union PACs, unions can't give money directly, from pursuing policies that would ultimately deconstruct those power centers. There's also things like permanent policy administrative states and the Washington Consensus, which could also be seen as a kind of controlling opposition. While certain high-stake issues, there's bipartisan concession that make the parties appear as two sides of the same coin. We sometimes call this the Ratchet effect. So the GOP moves the political spectrum to the right when in power, and the Democrats, when in power, often lock in those changes rather than reversing them. Obama codifying the Patriot Act and expanding domestic surveillance and expanding the drone policy, basically maintaining the policies of the Bush administration, as well as bailing out the banks, but only the banks and not really protecting homeowners during the Great Restructuring. Thus locking in massive bank grabs of private homes, which kind of led to the situation that we started seeing with home prices getting back expensive and out of control by the end of the teens. You can also think of the way the anti-war movement was played by Obama, since he was only actually even saying he was going to impose one of the two wars he inherited, which was the Iraq War. And he maintained even expansions of war capacity in Afghanistan. So on matters of military-industrial complex and the stability of this Federal Reserve, or on a whole lot of the administrative state, the policy outcomes of both parties look remarkably similar because they have remarkably similar interests and serve remarkably similar donors. But they weren't established to do that. They just do. So what you might call that as elite capture, maybe. It's not really the control opposition, though, of the classical conspiratorial variety. Although if we follow the logic of Marcuse or Debord or even Chomsky, we can see that the party is a boundary maker for what is considered reasonable or acceptable dissent, and will often go after acceptable dissent on the left harder than the right will go after its own acceptable dissent. For example, you have a lot more people attacking Hassan Piker in the Democratic Party than you have the GOP really going after Nick Fuentes, even if they both have congressional censors that don't matter. It's just basically saying they suck, passed on them. This argument is by allowing lively debate within a narrow window, like debating how much student debt for the give, whether questioning the existence of debt-based education in the first place, provides the public with a feeling of participation and a feeling of being actively listened to, but effectively the options are picked for you by the framing of the debate, ensuring the inner energy for change stays within a very narrow set of bounds. But again, that's manufacturing consent, or repressive tolerance, or the spectacle, call it what you want. They're not exactly the same thing, as we can go into, but they're very similar. When you think about this in a lot of ways, what you'll see is that they all effectively talk about the limits of acceptable action, and by naturalizing and making things seem pragmatic, which may actually just be a path dependency or something that people do in the past. Lastly, there's often a gap between the party's campaign rhetoric and legislative priorities. The observation that the party has a majority, there are often one or two conservative members, people like Joe Manchin or Kristen Sinema or any number of people, Senator Byrd, back when he was alive, who brought the most popular radical parts of the platform, but that since there's no will to, John Fetterman does this too, but since there's no will to oust them because it might risk caucus majority when they have them, you can see that this is built in. People know they're going to dissent, and they're just going to allow the villains to rotate. You definitely see this now with more and more people taking the follow-on bills to throw just enough to allow conservative bills to pass, where the Democrats really don't have much of a policy distinction from the Republicans. If when it's a typical soldier, it appears that there is a control failure. The party gets a claim that they wanted to pass the law, but they didn't, while ensuring their donors' interests are protected because they didn't, but internal dissent was at least given some outlet. This became kind of obvious in the Biden administration, including talk of backroom deals. And, the biggest one was AOC made the backroom deal with some, but not all, of the railway unions who were involved in the railway strike. And I would get DSAers to say the leadership approved of that. And yeah, the leadership was democratically elected, but there was a vote on the acceptable terms of the contract, and the leadership lost. So undercutting their own membership by making a deal with AOC is not the defense that you think it is. And that very much looks like a control opposition move. So, is the Democratic Party control opposition? Probably not in the first two stronger senses of the term, as in someone deliberately set them up to control the spectrum of debate. But in the way that things have been structurally set up, it is a recuperating party factor, just like, frankly, the GOP is for the right. Now, sometimes recuperation can change the content of the party's platforms. It's not without some effect. Civil rights leaders had some effect on that too, but it is still limited, particularly when you look at moderation and changing of definitions, changing of frameworks from abolish the police to defund the police, which is an objectively foolish contention. Compared to abolishment implies that you're getting rid of something, you might replace it with something else to serve the social function, but you're not, taking the money away from the people with all guns, and the ability to shake people down for things like tickets. Donor influence is a big one. It is a tragic but unavoidable reality of the current campaign finance system, but it also really does mean that basically the same people are people in the same class of people own both parties and control the limits of what they can probably get done. And there's policy continuity, whether it's the quote deep state theory, and yes, Virginia, there is a deep state, it's called the administrative state, or the maintaining of permanent bureaucracy between administrations, which makes it seem professional and the political, except it also means that a lot of politics is actually professionalized and removed from democratic oversight. This is a commitment to institutional stability and international obligation, but it's also a way to make sure your population doesn't get too uppity. Both things are true. And when I talk on the next video about the other groups that you mentioned, the DSA individual 5051, I will talk about this all in more detail. I'm also going to talk a little bit about different models to think about that may help you understand what's going on. I think the workshoot from wrestling and oligarchical opportunity capture and maybe even elite capture, although that's overstated. It's overstated because it makes it sound like elites just come in later and capture it, whereas often the elites are involved in the very beginning and are also beginning their capturing in moment one. But all the things aside, these may be more precise things to get to what you mean by control opposition. So, yeah, we'll come back and talk about that in terms of these other groups and maybe some other ways to think about it. On that, protect your peace. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. There's more behind the Patreon wall. Have a great day.